degrees out.
Okay, you ready?
Are we ready? Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah Downey. I'm an undergraduate here in the journalism department. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to thank George Clooney for coming. You know, he's an actor. He's on ER and some other stuff.
It was a doctor's show.
Oh, yeah. But I'd also like to thank and introduce Professor Marcia Rock, who is the director of the broadcast journalism program here at NYU, and pretty much responsible for making this all happen. So let's give her a round of applause.
I'd like to welcome all of you, and we're very excited that we have not just George Clooney, but Murrow himself, the actor David Strathairn, and the co-writer Heslov, and it's great to meet someone behind the scenes. I mean, you know who the other two are, but it's great to have someone who was so much a part of the production. And I just want to open by the fact that I require my students to watch Harvest of Shame every year.
It's a good one.
And they have to write a reaction paper. And all of a sudden this year, the reaction papers were just so excited and vibrant, and they were reacting to Murrow, and I said, what's changed? And then I realized they'd all seen Good Night and Good Luck, and I was thrilled that one of your objectives happened, that they really saw more in Murrow than they ever had before. So I have to thank you as a professor for that.
Thank Murrow. He did a pretty good job of it.
So I'd like to start with a few questions, and I know that you have a lot of things you want to say, and then we'll open it up to student questions, because the crew has to be out of here at 6 o'clock on the dot.
We're talking to people.
So I want to ask you about your dad first. Your dad was anchor news director in Cincinnati, and you...
And then at KNBC in Los Angeles for a few years.
So
Quit, didn't like it.
Didn't like it? So what did you learn about the news business from him, and did any of that affect...
Hang on, my agent's on the phone.
Cell phone's off. How did that play into wanting to do this film at all?
Oh, it was everything. The main reason for doing this film was I grew up on the floor of a newsroom in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents, you know, it's not like you're making a lot of money when you're a local broadcaster, and so in the summers they didn't have babysitters, so they just bring us to the TV station and we just hang out. And I became a floor director on a couple of different shows, and I worked on Bowling for Dollars, which was a bowling alley underneath the newsroom set. And they'd push the newsroom set away, and then they'd bring in an audience and have a bowling show, and then they'd, you know, put the set back down. And I ran the teleprompter for my dad when I was 9 or 10 years old. It was a great growing up, and it was great watching. It was an exciting time for news, and it was great watching. It was when live trucks first started. You know, everybody was very excited when they got live trucks, and it was a big deal. It was a very exciting time to watch my father, because you still wrote all of your own news then, and you were a news director, and it was fun to watch them come up with how to present the news. And it was the same battles that exist now, all the same. The names change, and sometimes it gets worse and better, but the truth is it was still the idea of how to not allow entertainment to completely force the news off of the broadcast air. And it's you know, my father always said it's waged, it's never won, and it's true.
He was a great admirer of Murrow. Do you want to talk about
Well, I think
that?
anybody you know, any broadcast journalism, Murrow's the high water mark, period. That's it. He's who you want to be. Trouble specter.
The police were just making sure that everything was all right here.
Fire law, we all get kicked out. Murrow was the high water mark. He's the guy.
I heard you you tried to do a little broadcast news in your career at a cable access station?
Yeah, I only lacked talent, other than that, and skill. Other than that, I was really good
I thought your actorly presentation would...
No, there's a very big difference between acting
What's
and...
the difference?
Well, you know, you're reporting, what I found, you know, my father was so successful, you know, in this little microcosm of Cincinnati, Ohio. He was Elvis, you know, everybody knew my dad. And he quit 3 different jobs in big sort of high profile quit, firing, quit kind of things, because they'd say, well, we want you to do this story. He quit at KNBC because they had a gangland shooting, and they wanted to bring on an actor from Hill Street Blues to talk on the news, and my dad he's an actor. Why would you? And they got in a big fight, and he quit, so he was always, everybody respects my father, always has. He still writes for the newspaper. So I sort of was able very quickly to get a microphone in my hand, much quicker than most would have been allowed to. I was studying journalism at Northern Kentucky University, and I was able to do, like, after the Bengals games, I would do reports. And, it required actually asking questions, and I'd corner somebody to be asking, Boomer Esiason a question, and I've already got all my questions sort of. He could have said, a house just landed on me, and I go, So in the third quarter, I wasn't listening, and my father always listened, and that's why he was so good at it, and that's why his interviews were always so good.
Well, as a director, are you listening now?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
That's why he's a director, he doesn't have to listen.
Direct, don't listen. Yeah, you listen a little bit, but not so much.
Well, for you and for Grant, I know you did a lot of research on Good Night and Good Luck, and looked at all the See It Nows, and looked at all of the Murrow films, and read everything about him, good and bad. So can you tell me a little bit about how the See It Now, what you learned from the See It Now that actually informed the film, and maybe if I can back this question up with, what about the negative things about Murrow, and how did you deal with the criticisms of him in terms of
We'll start with the other stuff.
Well, initially, the research started with Joe and Shirley Wershba, who live here in New York. And so George and I flew out here, and we met with them for a while. We actually taped Joe and Shirley talking for a long time, because there was one point we actually thought we might use the footage in the film. And they were a great place to start, because they knew all the players, and they knew all the little stories about these people that you never really know about. And one of the things that George's father had said to us before we started, in particular, was that just make sure you get all the facts straight. Make sure you get the facts straight. Because I didn't want to get the facts straight, I wanted to get it all wrong. But it was important, because he knew, and George knew as well, that if we didn't get the facts correct, that the film would be marginalized, and people would say, well, they got this wrong, so obviously this is a lot of crap. Then once we started to sort of focus in on the shows, on the See It Now shows, it became pretty clear, particularly to George, that this period of Murrow going after McCarthy seemed to be the most interesting and fruitful period of Murrow to sort of examine, and because we knew that we didn't want to do a biopic, we weren't doing the Ray version of Murrow. we really wanted to talk about issues and questions, and so that helped. So otherwise we would have been we did watch a lot of the See It Nows, but once we started got into this particular area, it was clear that this is where we wanted to be. Now the persons, that was a different story.
Oh my God.
We didn't know. We knew we were going to use a couple of clips, but we didn't know what they were going to be. And one night I was watching a lot of clips, and I called George up and I said, I got to play you this over the phone. Listen, this is Murrow interviewing Liberace. And
manna from heaven, when he says, the Princess Margaret's looking for a good man too.
and,
we're going to use that. But also, on the other hand, what you're talking about, the negative issues were, we were very careful. We tried to treat it exactly as Murrow did, and as my father always had, which is double sourcing, literally double sourcing every scene in this film, which was important to us, because there is a it's small but loud group of people out there that have written books and love to talk about the idea that Murrow is a traitor and that McCarthy was right after the Venona papers were released. Now, of course, that's wrong, and the reason it was wrong and why we put it in the film was it was all based on the Annie Lee Moss stuff, which we could prove. They said, though, they could prove that she's a communist, which they can't. But the important part of it was that's not what Murrow ever said. He was too smart for that. And he said, you'll note that the senator nor this reporter knows or claims that she is or isn't a communist. We demand she has the right to face her accuser. That's why he lasts the test of time. But we thought we had to go through any chance that someone would have. And this is a good trick my father's always used in reporting too, which is to take the gun out of the other guy's hand, is to go through everything. We went through journalism schools who had, they would mock up these things and go through it and come up with, editorializing was the big one that came up, often. So we brought in editorializing and talked about it. The big one was the Alger Hiss piece, where he didn't defend McCarthy for getting the Alger Hiss thing wrong, and he went after everything else, and he would look like defending a known communist. We put in the William F. Buckley. They wanted Buckley to do the debate, and a very conservative reviewer, wrote out, "Well, this is absolutely horseshit. They would never." They asked some 29-year-old guy, McCarthy would, and he goes, "So I called Buckley." And he gets Buckley on the phone, and Buckley's like, "Well, as a matter of fact, they did. I did call me." Because had we gotten even that wrong, you know what I mean? Then they go, "Okay, it's all horseshit." So our trick was to treat everything very, very carefully along the way.
But there were a couple things to address your question as well. Is that Murrow was late to the game in this.
Oh, sure.
And he did get some knocks for that. And you and I, we spoke about this a little bit earlier. But for us, we come into our story at the moment when he makes the decision to finally go. But there is a backstory though that
we see it though at times in the film. I think it's important to remember that television in general, in those kind of worlds, when you had the guy who was the most trusted man in America, when the two great moments in broadcast journalism, the two moments that changed policy immediately, Cronkite coming back from Vietnam and saying this war doesn't work, and Murrow saying whoever disagrees with McCarthy, step out. Those two moments that were instantaneous. All of a sudden it was 15-1 letters, and they thought they were in the minority, and that was in Ohio. That wasn't just in New York and Los Angeles. What television, although late to the game, it played on a much bigger scale. So when it happened very quickly, and it was so they were right to go late. They had to be sure of their facts.
Having worked on this and studied Murrow's character. This is for anyone who wants to go for it. What did you learn new about the man that we might not know?
David?
Well, I feel like I'm probably talking to people who know more about him than I do. I don't know. What did I learn about him? I learned a lot about him. I didn't know much about him at all.
You've never even heard about him before.
I thought the actor that I was playing across from the actor who was playing Joseph R. McCarthy was pretty well cast. There's a vast amount that I learned about the man. And spending time with his words was quite a privilege. And you start to not only understand his professionalism and his passion, but who he was or you can sort of construe as who he was as a human being. You start with this event, and you see this person inside this event and what he is forging and what he is taking on his shoulders, and for the sake of the civilization, you say, well, this is a pretty high standard. But as I explored the man from there on down, the pyramid just got like that. So it really was a culmination of who he was at this particular moment in his life.
Was there a line that gave you the key to his character?
A line? No.
A light, maybe.
The light, yeah.
A cigarette lighter.
Well, I came up with this cockamamie image of him as the cigarette. People see this sort of elegant thing, poised, still, and this stuff coming off of it. But right at the tip of it, there's something burning. And I had the sense that this is inside this man, something was burning, which eventually burned him from the inside out. He died of cancer, and to put it literally at age 57. But I get back to that image of this. and then this. He was the package that you could infer from this. Very, very amazing, amazing man.
Was there anything that made you want to do this film now?
Oh, I don't know. Look, I mean, I've had this conversation a few times before, but there's some truth in it. You know, if you're, you know, when you go out, you know, when you about 2.5 years ago, Grant and I had been talking about doing this for a while. I looked at it as a movie of the week years before. We thought about doing it as a live project, and then Janet Jackson took her breast out on live TV, and that was the end. That's the truth, actually. We were doing it at CBS, and then Les is like, we can't. But,
Thankfully, she took it up.
yeah, we promised we wouldn't take our breasts out. And tonight too, because it's too cold. And then, you know, I was on the cover of a couple of magazines and called a traitor for saying we should ask some questions before we send some people out to war. And they had a deck of cards and a lot of internet stuff. And the truth was, fair enough, you know, if you're going to speak up and demand the freedom of speech, you can't say, but don't say bad things about me. So fair enough, I can take that. But I started hearing things like, you're either with us or with the enemy. Not even with us or against us, but with us or with the enemy, which is the statute of treason. And it started to concern me again, the idea that this is cyclical, that we do this. You know, we lose our minds every 30 or 40 years, and we lose our speaker system. And we do, you know, after Pearl Harbor, we round up every Japanese American and we put them in a camp and we figure it out. We go, well, that's not very sporting of us. That's not really what we do. And so we stop and we fix it. But it usually comes out of fear. And McCarthy was that. McCarthy capitalized on fear. And I felt that there was a huge amount in the Fourth Estate and in people in general of lack of curiosity or lack of the fortitude to go in and ask the tough questions. And that's always a dangerous place, because the one thing we know, and the one thing that my father always taught me, is that power unchallenged corrupts, no matter who that is. And that it is your job always to challenge whoever is in power. Doesn't matter who it is. Democrat, conservative, whoever it is, that's the job of the Fourth Estate, is to challenge it. And so we started looking back at some of those speeches, and you hear things like, we cannot desert freedom, we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. And you're thinking, wow, that's nice to hear. That's interesting to hear again. And that we're not descended from fearful men, from men who feared to write or speak or defend the causes that were for the moment unpopular. You go, wow. And dissent is not disloyalty. And all of a sudden I thought, well, you know, at the very least, all of these issues, you know, when you see the Box of Lights and Wire speech and he says, let's take an hour off of Ed Sullivan to talk about the problems in the Middle East. That's 1958. You realize that nothing's different. And everything my dad talks about being waged and not won is true. So that I thought it was a good time to have that conversation again. I didn't think that the times would change in the last 6 months like they have. We figured we were really going to be getting our hands slapped between this and Syriana. And things changed in the last 6 months, and now, you know, even sort of the more conservative sort of side of it was like, yeah, well, that's fair game, you could talk about that. And wow, things have changed.
How did Fox respond?
The way you would expect. Actually, Bill O'Reilly gave a good review until he found out something I'd said about him the day before. Then he said, yeah, I said it was a good film, but, you know, I can't recommend him as a human being. So he took out an ad that says, I like the film, can't recommend George Clooney as a human being. Another quality man. Yeah. It's fair. You can't argue with him on that one. Yeah, there's some truth there.
And what about civil liberties? We talked about sort of the Fourth Estate. What about?
Well, I think that's the main issue. You know, the Patriot Act, ultimately, that they're voting on today. The main issue is, again, the idea that, for instance, Radulovich was the first one for Murrow to get in on, and basically they put a sealed envelope in front of him and said, "You're guilty." Now, take an honorable discharge and you can get out, you know. And the one thing we know is that that's not what our country is based on. Writ of habeas corpus, you know, the right to face your accuser, period. Either you're a prisoner of war and you get Geneva Convention rights, or you're a criminal and you get the writ of habeas corpus and the right to face your accuser in a speedy trial. So all of those issues again come up, and we talk about them again. And I think that those are all important issues to talk about. But that, again, it goes back to this, and why we're here is, this is where it all comes from. I mean, every single great social and political movement that has ever happened in this country has been led by journalism. It always has. It's always been led by it. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Watergate. I mean, go down the list of things that have mattered over, you know, the New Deal, the Great Society. All of them were run and led by very brave journalists over the periods of time, and that's why it's important to talk about it constantly.
Milo Radulovich came to talk to you, or you? What
Yeah.
was that like? And what was his reaction?
Oh, he's great. He's so thankful. He's so excited. He's doing his own sort of Q&A around California. He emails me every day. But he's still a big, you know, liberal.
His sister probably is a communist. Though.
Yeah.
She actually probably is.
I think she is a communist.
Yeah.
And he came out here. We opened the New York Film Festival, and he came out, and he and Joe and Shirley were that night. You know, it was the greatest night of his life. It was really fantastic.
I came out of the screening in this big Avery Fisher Hall, and we had been up on the side, and he was sitting up here, and we were sitting down here, and the doors were right out to the, you know, whatever, outside the theater, and comes down, I pop out, and he pops out, and no one else is in the hall at that moment, and it was like Rumpelstiltskin coming out. He was so happy. He was just jumping up and down like he's a small, you know, amazing, energized guy, and then beaming, so proud. He was like a kid who just, I don't know, it was so great.
He took a big stand. He's a very brave guy.
Very brave guy.
Back then to do what he did.
Getting back to to McCarthy, I've been teaching Murrow for a while, and I never thought that he was drunk.
Oh, McCarthy?
Yeah, but
McCarthy was badly drunk in the
I never picked that up.
In the rebuttal show, when you watch the whole thing, he pre-filmed it, and and he did an exact telephone, and it's about it's 28 minutes and 28 seconds. He timed it so that you couldn't have any kind of a comment on it at the time. Right. And the problem with McCarthy was he was really good at quick sound bites, but he was really horrible if he had to have sort of any sort of extended period of time. And if you watch that whole half an hour, it's unbelievable, because he literally he's like runs out of steam. He's like, you sir, that I just runs out of gas the whole way, and he died of cirrhosis of the liver not long after that.
In Ann Sperber's book Murrow, she cites that CBS President Stanton commissioned a Roper poll about that weekend that the McCarthy response was on, and that 59% of the adult population watched McCarthy, which was more than watched the original Murrow show, and 33% felt he proved Murrow was pro-communist or raised doubts about him. I'm not sure that's the impression we get from the film.
Yeah, but you have to think about it. I mean, the one thing you have to remember is that means that 67% of the country didn't. That's a huge number. If you have a 67% popularity, I think Bush would take that. Right? Understanding that before you went in there, it's like if you go immediately after a convention, you get a bump. So that was the best numbers he was going to get. But the more important thing was, and what was really interesting about the broadside to McCarthy in this, was that Murrow's attack on McCarthy, although it was brilliant, is not what hurt McCarthy. McCarthy's rebuttal against Murrow is what really destroyed McCarthy. Because the one thing everyone knew was that Murrow wasn't a traitor to his country. You could see in absolute stark reality his technique, which was to turn around and say, the cleverest of the jackal pack. And we knew that he sat in a plane over the battles in London and read to us about, the explosions looking like puffed rice on black velvet. We knew he was more than a hero. And when he was called a traitor by by McCarthy, that for people in the collective at home watching, to see that out loud really changed the effect of what of McCarthy's effect.
What's the role of political films in our culture today? And have you picked up on a trend that started by the documentaries like Fahrenheit 9/11?
Well, I don't. It's funny. I think it's the other way around. I truly am the believer that we reflect, we being films reflect society. Don't sort of try to lead it. I find that if you look back at the time that we did our best filmmaking in this country, from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s, and all the great sort of protest films that came out of those films, including sort of very up-the-middle softballs like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but it still takes on very important issues. All of those films came out of all of those incredible upheaval that was going on in the 60s and 70s between Watergate and, we've gone through all those before, the civil rights movement and the women's rights movements and all of that. And then all these amazing films sort of reflected that. We then, as a society, really haven't given a shit for about 20 years about politics. Really, I mean, we don't care about the Iran-Contra. It didn't really matter. Most of the stuff didn't really matter. And in the last 3 or 4 years, that has mattered again. And films take about, we're not first responders. We take about 2 or 3 years to react. We have to write a screenplay, sell a book, get a screenplay, and then eventually make a film and then release it. And now you look around and you're starting to see some films coming out that reflect questions asked again in society. I think that's a good thing. I think that's, I think people want to be able to go out and say, okay, that represents what I believe, or I'll give you 15 reasons why that's wrong. I think that's a good thing. I don't think all film has to do that. I like a good entertainment as much as anybody. But
do you see yourself sort of in the Murrow thing where you get to do this kind of film if you do the other?
Yeah, but I think every human being alive is. The deals that you guys are going to have to make to get the stories that you want out are going to make you sick sometimes. That's the deal. I mean, it is the deal. You'll go, okay, I got to go cover Thursday's Child, and do it, and they'll have a story, and you'll go, wow, this is really exciting, and there's nothing inventive or dangerous, but maybe just then, if I do this, they'll let me do that, and that's the deal that everybody makes, I think.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience, and if you can raise your hand, we have two people, one on this side and one on that side with a microphone. If you could, the two of you can just take your places. And then you can raise your hand and we'll pass the mic to you. So my last question is, the other film that I have my students watch is Primary.
Oh, great.
And I read that was an inspiration for you, and I was just wondering why. Primary was the first verite film. It happened when they were able to have a 16mm camera with portable sound. And Drew and Penny Baker covered the primary of Humphrey and Kennedy in Wisconsin. Yeah. And he actually walks up on the stage with Jackie and Jack, and sees the audience, what we're so used to now, and it was the first time you were sort of there following. And how did that inform
and how film? Sad it was that, Humphrey would show up, and he was sort of this loved guy, and he would show up, and there would be no one there. And Kennedy was like a rock star everywhere he went. Right. It was amazing. The same hall, 2 days later. Yeah. But we studied when we decided how we wanted to shoot the film. We studied Point of Order and Pen of Acre films, and then what we really focused on was Crisis, the other Drew one, and Primary, because we wanted to shoot it that way. We wanted to feel like the way they shot documentaries in the 50s and 60s. And that's all. I mean, that was what we focused on. We didn't shoot on 16mm because we wanted a little more.
But you used 2 cameras, right?
Always.
Although we considered it. But
yeah, we tried 16mm. We did some camera tests. And we wanted to get these Godard lenses, but you'd actually have to gappers tape them to the camera to make them work.
The other thing it reminded me of was Studio 90. There was an intensity to it that felt like a Chayefsky film.
Playhouse?
Was that, yeah, Playhouse, oh, right, Playhouse 90.
Yeah.
Of course, my students didn't know what Playhouse 90 was, and I felt really old, but I watched when I was.
Well, when we did all the television stuff
live
in the
television
studio,
dramas.
but all the stuff we did in the studio that had to have, we really focused on sort of Frankenheimer, Lumet television type format in the way we shot it. Very straightforward, very sort of people talking very directly to one another, and very straightforward in that sense. But then when we got inside the back rooms, we just, it was fun. We gave all the actors newspapers from October 4th, 1954, and they'd all sit down, and David would sit down. They'd all sit at typewriters and type stories on their manual typewriters, and then we would come in and we'd sit down. And I'd be the news director, Fred Friendly, and I'd go, okay, what's your lead? And each of them, we had 2 cameras going, and we shot all that stuff, and that's how we got those scenes.
Oh, that's great. How did you do? Did you get your stories?
I never got a story on
He kept going to the obits. I just...
Okay, who would, anyone have a question?
I think it's on. Wait, just
try it. I think it's on.
Thank you for this great opportunity. And actually, I'm an international student, and I'm from Japan. And I'm really curious, how do you expect your film will be accepted in other countries?
Well, we've only opened in one that was in Italy, and we did really, ridiculously well.
And Australia, we opened in Australia, and it's amazing. The journalists were all over it like a rabbit.
They're going through a sedition law. They're trying. I think they're passing it this week, right?
Yeah.
So they're a little concerned with those same sort of,
Yeah. They have no freedom of speech in Australia. I don't know if you knew that or not. I didn't. But it's not written into whatever their constitution is. They don't have freedom of speech, so they're all over this film.
That's a bad thing.
That's a bad thing. Yeah.
So I don't know. I think we'll see. It'll play well in England. It'll play well in France. It'll play well in places that are familiar with the same issues that they're going through. I don't know about Japan.
Are you surprised that it's still doing so strong?
Yeah, we're really surprised.
What do you attribute it to? I mean,
I think it's because of Grant being in it.
Yeah. And also because of the black and white.
Yeah, because we figured black and white's huge. I think, and the girls showing up to see David.
Yeah. And the car crash. The car crash is.
Oh yeah, the car crashes.
All those things.
All the action sequences. The love scene. Yeah, the nudity, love scene.
Mr. Clooney, you have invested in a black and white feature film. You've invested in a casino in Vegas. What has been the biggest risk that you've taken?
Easy. Talking to Howard Kurtz's daughter. Biggest risk. There was one night in Vegas, but that doesn't count. That doesn't seem to be fair, really. I don't know. I think it's not. They're not risks if you don't feel in jeopardy. And I tend to not look at things from a place that I don't work from a place of fear. So I don't really think I've risked anything. People will at times say, "Well, this was really, that these films like Syriana was really brave to do." What are you gonna do? Wake up at 7 and go, "What? You know what I should have done?" I'd be the riskiest thing I could do is, chicken shit out of doing things that I want to do. I really want to. You want to push it as long as they let you play with the toys and before they take it away, and they will take them away. The riskiest thing physically was being in. We were in Morocco and Dubai during Ramadan, right when they were cutting everybody's heads off, and it wasn't the safest place to be at the time. So physically risky. That was we were sort of big gold targets there when we were shooting Syriana, but I look like Raymond Burr in it anyway, so they weren't going to kidnap me.
They're not fond of Raymond Burr.
Oh, they don't like him? No. Old Ironside.
Next question.
Hi. You mentioned Lumet and Chesky earlier. I know you have a deal with CBS Network. What are your plans for that, and who do you want to play Howard Beale?
We're so early into it, we haven't even acquired the rights yet. So we haven't had any discussions about
Les came to us. Les Moonves came to us and said he wanted to do it, and we said, "Really?" And he goes, "Like we've done Failsafe Live," and we said, "Because network is, goes right at you." he says, you know, okay, let's do it. But we're having some rights issues right now, so it's a trickier thing than we thought. Michael Caine would be a good Howard Beale, though, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Was there
Or Abe Vigoda, either one.
was there
I'm
a,
mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
was there a moment of tension or conflict between the two of you when you were writing?
Always.
Oh,
It's a constant.
there is right now, actually.
It's a constant state of conflict. Not really. Not about the writing.
There's something about Grant and I met in an acting class in 1982. He loaned me $100 to get headshots for an audition for Joni Loves Chachi that he got.
Most of the people here don't even know what that
Joni Loves Chachi.
No.
Really?
That's how old we are.
That was a new show.
Yeah.
So Jesus, wow, we're old.
Okay, we have another question.
I noticed in the film, with the exception of the bar scene and a few other scenes, a lot of the movie took place in the CBS newsroom, which I thought was interesting because it created a lot of tension and intensity. What was your intention in writing it and filming it like that?
Such a narrow focus and setting.
Well, it's all we could only afford. We could just afford to stand there and set.
That's it. That's actually
That's
true.
part of the reason we knew we had a limited amount of money, so that we weren't going to be able to shoot these big exterior shots. But also something that George talked about from the very beginning of the writing is that we had to create a sense of fear, and it's interesting and great that you picked up on it. We had to find a way to bring the fear into the room, bring that time back, particularly to people who weren't there. So
You wanted to if you put people in a room. If you look at some of those great Lumet films, like early films like Failsafe or 12 Angry Men, you can create an external fear if you don't go out, if you don't see it. If you look at all those old Twilight Zones, for instance. You know what Twilight Zones are? 'Cause I will slash my wrist.
Isn't that what we're in?
We are right now. They're in the Twilight Zone. We're in the Twilight Zone. You guys, are we here? So if you create this external fear, it's easier to keep it tense the less times you go out. You're sort of letting the air out of the balloon every time you do. So we just try to keep it inside that stage.
There's a question in the back. Did you get the mic working?
What was your budget?
$7.5 billion.
Okay, we have a question back there.
Billion.
All right, this.
Yes, FEMA actually paid for it.
Is this working?
Yes, it
okay.
is.
It is.
One of the things that struck me the most of the film was how beautiful and poetic Murrow's speeches were, and the just well-constructed essays and the writing of the newscast. And you kind of don't see that on today's cable news programs, let's say, for instance, that are pretty influential. Do you guys have friends who are on those shows or who produce the shows, and do you ever talk about that with them, and how do those conversations go? Because you don't want to offend your friends, but you want to bring up issues.
No, it's a tricky thing. Les Moonves came to the premiere, and he's the guy who said, maybe we'll make it the naked news. Now he's sort of kidding, but he's Paley. He's caught in a weird position between the two. How do you keep the news on the air and keep it? David Weston, who's the head of ABC News, was great. He said, listen, if I'm honest with myself, I'm the guy that says every once in a while, don't do that story, if I'm honest. Because I'd like to think that I back every kid who comes in, who's armed with with good intentions, but because I don't always do it. To us, that was a great dialogue to open up and have those conversations. In terms of talking like that, nobody really. Diane Sawyer sent me a great note just saying, why doesn't anyone, speak like that anymore? And I think we don't speak like that in general, but he was just, look, there's Patty Chayefsky and there's Edward R. Murrow. There aren't very many guys who wrote like that, I think. When you saw, when you started doing the words, it was like,
Amazing. But I sort of throw it back to you, and this is a frontier that you guys are packing up for, and it's hedged on all sides by what? by the competition to get people to listen to you, the money to get someone to pay for you to say what you want to say, and the time that you're allowed to say it. And that's just the surface of the reasons why it has fractured into a world of bites and undigested, and it's really very, very slippery slope out there. And I don't, how do you prepare them? What are you packing in your,
We teach Murrow.
You teach Murrow, but would Murrow exist today?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Look what's happened to Bill Moyers. It's a very, very challenging thing, and it starts in 4th grade. It starts in 5th grade. You can stand up in front of the class and say what you know to your class. Can you actually speak what you know, so that they will learn it and will think about it, or do you tell them what to think about? That's the gauntlet that's laid out there for you. And these conversations go on all the time with journalists. I've done, a lot of talkbacks where there are journalists and talking with journalists in interviews, and they're going to me, well, how do we fix it? How can we fix it? I'm an actor, But the word is all, and the word is now becoming less. It's becoming something else. So I don't know, you guys. It's up to you.
Fix it up.
Fix it, goddammit, help us.
Well, it's interesting that he made so many references to Shakespeare, and I wonder if an audience today could handle it. But they're certainly paying their money to go to your movies, and listening to Shakespeare.
Well, maybe we'll see. So.
Up here.
Narnia did pretty well too. The Lion's God or something, I think.
Yeah.
Mr. Clooney, you had mentioned your father refused to do an interview with an actor and ended up quitting his job. And I was wondering if any conflict has ever become of you and your father after maybe he reads a statement that you made politically or anything like that, being an actor yourself.
Well, I mean, it's a different thing. My father and I agree politically. So, I mean, I grew up a son of a, there weren't a whole lot of liberals in Kentucky, but we were it. So, he agrees with what I say. And, the truth of the matter is I don't hold a press conference and say, hey, here's what you should think or say. I've answered questions in an interview, which is my right to do. And then, you get vilified for it and you go, okay, fair enough. If you're going to say it, you got to take your hits. My dad would have been very angry with me if I'd not said what I thought or what I believed. I think I would have been embarrassed to go back and look him in the eye, because he's the guy that always said, if you don't, he was the guy that said, if somebody does something, he's the guy that always at every time did the right thing. And it's a really noble thing. People love him. It's not so easy being the child of someone like that, because you're in Kentucky, you're at a table, and we're out to dinner, which we didn't really get to do all that often when we were young, and someone would say it'd be some racial slur because it's Kentucky in 1970, and my sister and I would be eating, we'd hear it, and we'd be like, oh Jesus, we'd start eating as fast as we could, because we knew my dad was going to go, what the fuck is wrong with you? And storm out. And so we'd be shoveling food, So I would say it was easier to sort of be, to look at it and be a friend of someone who's sort of, has those kind of ideals than to actually be the child of one. But I'm proud of it now. I used to think, can't you just not hear it? And I'm really proud of the fact that he could not, that he wouldn't not hear it. He said, what did he say at this panel you did with him?
He said that as a journalist, the responsibility of journalists is to always look after those who have less power than you and always ask questions of those who have more power than you. That's the responsibility of the journalist.
That's sort of his philosophy, and he doesn't mind that. He doesn't see any great conflicts there. Yeah, as long as that's father-son shit.
This is addressed to any of you. Could you and would you have made a film like this if Murrow's politics were more radical or unsavory in some way? If he were less heroic and kind of iconic.
Oh, wait, go back because I'm confused. Because the movie is about the specific issues.
But a movie like this, in which you do have a kind of political message, which is for most people in this room very positive. I mean, we all agree with it. But say if he were a different kind of person, like truly a communist, or his politics were more radical or ideologically at odds.
Murrow's politics?
If he or someone else, if another character that you were dealing with, could you have made a film like this? I mean, if the messenger were different, would you still have, used him as an example to get across your political message?
Well, yeah, but it's not necessarily trying to make a political message. It's still a historical piece. I mean, I could take the knock on Syriana easier because it's a work of fiction. And you could go, well, we're taking on a series of subject matters that you could say, well, these people are, either you agree with or disagree with the protagonist. This stuff all actually happened, so there are tough ones to kind of balance between, or answer that question. Would we be willing to do a story about, like, I guess Capote would be an answer like that, where some of the things he's doing are questionable as a journalist, where he's crossing the lines and doing things like that. Yeah, I'm up for doing any film that questions any of those issues. I just thought that this was a good one because I knew about it and I understood it pretty well.
Okay, there's a question here.
I guess this is for anyone, but if you just said it's not overtly a political film. I mean, it's a story, it's a historical film, but clearly the political message or the asking the question message is there. Do you think it's easier to create a movie that sort of sugarcoats the political thing by encasing it in an entertainment type of story than it is to just create a straight up political film, a film that has the statement and then more of a documentary style film?
It's certainly more interesting to me to find a story an interesting story that there happens to be a message, that you get this message, that we don't have to hit it over the head, that it doesn't have to be obvious. Maybe it is obvious to you, maybe it is anyway, I'm not sure, but for us it felt that the story was the most important part. And a lot of it, in the writing of it, a lot of it was sort of, after the fact. Wow, you didn't even realize how some of the things that were going to come out of this when we were writing it. Initially, it was really to talk about what George has already mentioned, was the constitutional issue, the right to meet your accuser, which rings more true right now than it has in the past, but it's always been an important message. So,
David?
There's something in there, that question, that you will be making movies in a way. You will be entertaining people. You will be delivering ideas and information. And Murrow was always a radio man, and he felt he was loath to get into television. He knew what it meant, just in the pure physics of it. When you put a face with a word or an image behind a word, you immediately have spin. Something is going to create a different connotation. Like if this was in color, you would have experienced a different thing. If it had a score, you would have a different feeling. The camera angles, you would have had a different insight. You would have a different emotional or intellectual reaction. So the choice to do this, the way this was done, which I think the accomplishment is brilliant, because the template was Murrow's see it now in person to person. And if you watch how he used the camera, he wanted to make sure it wasn't using him. But in making news or entertainment, or wanting to entertain people to entertain ideas, you're going to have an infinite amount of tools to do that. If you want to propagandize, you can do that like that. That's all opinion and sensate, tools. If you want to documentarize, you're making a choice as to what you're looking at. You're making a choice of what you want them to see. So you choose your issue, and you decide how to deliver it. Murrow delivered it as
dry and as pristine and as clear and as unadulterated as he could. And still, you get an idea of what he was feeling and what he was thinking. So that's a very interesting thing to consider. You know, if you wanted to make a movie about an idea that is very important to you, and it's just how I feel about the idea, you're going to bring all the attendant things to it that make you feel that this is what you feel. And you want people to understand what you feel. But if you want people to explore what they feel, then that's the challenge. That's the real difficult thing. And you know, I think this is crafted like a piece of music in the way that it works upon the psyche in a different way, that we receive auditory information more than we do, in a different way than we do visual information. And that's why Murrow thought the word heard was more important than the word seen delivered. So it's very, very interesting thing when you, as a filmmaker or as somebody who is going to be a two-dimensional presence to the world, giving them something to think about.
Okay.
Lights in a Box has always been one of my favorite speeches. It's on my bulletin board. And it was a brilliant way to start the movie. I'm just wondering, as a person, how much mixed with courage, was there an element of self-destruction that you also saw in Murrow, that he would give that speech at RNTDA, which of course effectively ended his career politically anyway?
I don't think, it's a funny thing, I don't ever think it was self-destruction. I think he was, he was the king. He really was, even when he was, when certain bits of power were being taken away. If you walk down the street here in New York, you know, he's Ed, or he's Mr. Murrow. He was the king. And he was the king because he'd done it in London, and he was worshipped from London. And then from all the stuff he did with McCarthy and the later with the Harvest of Shame and those things, he really, whether or not he had all the power, he still walked down the street and had all of the respect from everybody. So when he gets up and stands up there and says, "Shame on you," I don't think there's a thought in his head that's like, well, this is going to be self-destructive. I think it's a thing where he's going to go, he's just pissed. And he's like, "Fuck you." And he gets up there and he goes, "Here's what it is." And he really nails it. Now, of course, he alienates Paley and he never works again for the group and all those things. But I don't think that was necessarily self-destructive as it was, you know, if it's self-destructive, it's the guy who's throwing himself on a hand grenade, you know, to save the troops. He believed he was right. And when you read those lines, how right he was is insane, and how right those words continue to be. So I don't know that it was. I mean, the self-destruction. I think you could go back to smoking so much, and how actually what we found mostly from learning about him, from his son and from all the other people, is how fragile he was physically all the time. He was sick most of the time. In fact, he went away just before the McCarthy rebuttal. He went home and he was like, they thought he was going to die, right? He was
he was very, very sick, you know. And Fred called him, you know, and said, you know, "Can you do this?" And he heard about the rebuttal, and you know, his body took the hindmost, really. It wasn't about self-destruction. And George is so right. He threw him. He was self-destructing just because he was. It's weird to say, but he was being. The stress that he was under was destroying him, but he was compartmentalized from that. That didn't matter. He'd be standing in the middle of the fire, telling you how hot it is while he's burning. You know, that's the kind of guy he was. You know? And that's something
that's what you guys should be doing, right?
Yeah. You know, when you make the self-destruction as to saying what you believe, they don't. In my mind, how can you self-destruct if you say what you believe?
Well, on that note, I promised to get our guests out at 6 o'clock, and I'm going to be good on my word. And we're just so grateful that you had the time to come down here and that you brought your friends. We're just so delighted. So thank you very much.
I hope so. I certainly hope so because he's, well, as you guys know, he's the patron saint of what you do, and also not only that, he was an incredibly important man in American history. So I hope that we got, and I think we did. I think we, more importantly, we presented what he said and what he stood for, and the standards that he set. I think that comes across very clearly.
So why did you feel it was important to make this movie now?
I thought it was, when we started putting it together, it was a couple of years ago, and the environment then for freedoms of, mostly for civil liberties in general, were starting to be really knocked around, I thought. And when you start looking at those Murrow speeches, which are pretty timeless, you find that those are, many of the issues that he was talking about in 1954 are still issues today. And I thought it was good to hear those words again, and to remember that all these things that sort of sometimes seem hopeless, the Patriot Act sort of attack on civil liberties, the responsibility of the Fourth Estate, are cyclical, and that we do this every 30 or 40 years. We lose our minds up for a second, and that we get it back, and that's sort of why we're good at it. And that's why it's important to have journalists out there. Well, I don't know that it's, I think it's pointing out that there's nothing new. I think it's also pointing out that the most important thing we have in government is the Fourth Estate, the most important thing. Jefferson, obviously, you guys know, talks about it, but it's the truth. Because the one thing we know over the history of our country is power unchecked corrupts, always, every time. And my father was an anchorman, and in 1975 he went after Jimmy Carter when the OPEC nations raised the price of gas, and in 1976 or 77, or I guess before that, 75, he went after Gerald Ford for pardoning Nixon. The point was whoever was in power at the time, you went after him because you have to. That's your job. And there's a time, we go through these periods of time where it becomes unpatriotic to do that. That's stopped now. Katrina stopped it. But there was a period of time that was going on. We've done that before, And so it's a good thing to always remind ourselves that every single great social event we've had in our history, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, anyone, you go through all of them, the New Deal, the Great Society, were all led by journalists, all of them. And that's what's important, and that's sort of why I think that this is an important film.
Well, on the heels of that, why is it important to speak with colleges, journalism schools in particular, to young people?
Well, because, I've been to a bunch of them. We were at SC and UCLA out there, and some great old reporters were there. Norman Corwin was there. He was this great old reporter. And, a kid stood up, and he's about 6'4", and he's handsome, he's over at SC, so he's really good looking. And he goes, well, what happens when you ask these tough questions and somebody labels you as unpatriotic? And Norman's like, stand up. And he stands up. He goes, how tall are you? And he's like 6'4". And he goes, you're 6'4". You can take it. Because who's accomplished anything in their lives that didn't require alienating somebody or sticking your neck out somewhere along the way? And so, if you walk into the door and somebody sees this film, I know when I was a young man and I was studying journalism, I saw these Murrow speeches, and they made me want to do my job better. Now, I ended up doing my job very badly, so I became an actor, but it made me want to. And so, if that along the way inspires somebody to say, you know what, maybe I'm going to draw certain lines in the sand that I'm not going to cross, then we win. Then we win something along the way.
George and Grant thought that if they had an actor playing Joseph R. McCarthy, no one would have believed him because the behavior was so bizarre and arch, and they thought that's an actor making up, weird, outlandish behavior. But more so that Murrow decided to present McCarthy and McCarthy's own in himself, and sort of have him hoist himself on his own sword in a journalist's way, as opposed to trying to put any spin and say this is what the man said. Let's have the man say it himself. So that, I think, was a brilliant choice, not only by Murrow but also to respect Murrow's professionalism and his standards of journalism. George said, let's do it the way he did it. Well, it speaks to a lot of things, I believe. about the responsibility of the Fourth Estate in order to make a viable democracy, and the responsibility of journalists to be our canaries in the mines, so to speak, those people who are that we entrust to give us truthful and insightful and informative information about what's going on in our worlds. And the film speaks to a lot of things I believe in.
Were you familiar with Edward Murrow?
Sorry?
Were you familiar with Edward Murrow before you made the
No, I was about 5 years old when this event happened, and but I came to learn of him obviously through school. Yeah.
This movie has done a lot of press, especially towards college crowds. Why, in particular, are the college students important?
The future. That's the next wave who will be carrying our history with them. History is being made every day, and it's very hard to keep up with what happened even 50 years ago. But when there are things like this, when people like this and events like this are presented to a populace, it's very, very important that we remember our history, because we're doomed to repeat it if we don't. These are the new minds. These are the next pioneers in whatever fields that are out there, and for them to have as much of and as comprehensive as understanding of where we have come from as a culture and as a people, it can only it can only do good to have it, have them aware of it.